Welcome to From the Mind of Christine McConnell. Today's episode is gloves. This is something I have wanted to tackle for a while just because I love collecting vintage antique gloves, but none of them really fit because I've got really long fingers, and so finding vintage gloves that are going to work is really tricky. I still wear them, but having some that actually truly fit would be amazing. This is something you can hire somebody to do for you, but I would really rather just learn it myself. So that's what we're doing in this episode. And I'm starting by, I found a pair on eBay that are kind of stained and ruined. And so I want to dismantle these to kind of get a better sense of how the pattern works. So that's how we're starting today. Dismantling damaged pieces to sort of understand how they operate is actually how I taught myself how to sew in the first place. And it's really wonderful to sort of find something that was obviously well made at one point, but has, lived the life it's going to, and now it gets a second life as a teaching tool. Okay, so this is a really unusual shape. I've never dismantled a pair of gloves before, so I didn't know it could look like this. I know it's important because it gives your thumb a lot of mobility, and I'm not really interested in reinventing the wheel, so I am going to be duplicating this little section into my own pattern. For anyone who ever made a paper cutout turkey in elementary school, this next part will be very familiar to you. You're just going to take your hand out and trace out the outline, keeping it pretty tight, and then once you have it down on paper, you're just going to smooth out those lines into something we can actually use as a pattern. Once we've got it looking nice and clean, we're going to cut it out. I'm going to actually cut out the thumb separately because we're going to be using that for a separate pattern piece. Once that is done, you can take that piece with the 4 fingers, trace it out again on a piece of paper, and create a line right down next to the index finger. We're going to actually be folding this in half to create our glove pattern. You'll notice that I widened the pattern right there on the index finger and left a little extra, and that's because that little section is actually going to wrap along the side of your finger, so you're going to want to make sure you have some additional allowance there. I'm now ready to move on to working out the thumb pattern. So I've traced out that thumb shape that I actually got for my real thumb, and I'm laying out that cutout from that antique glove right on top of it, and I'm just trying to duplicate exactly the directions that pattern worked out. It's not going to be an identical replica. Once the shape was looking pretty right, I folded it in half and began cutting it out, and then just testing it against my thumb to sort of get a sense of how it would fit. To create a pattern that was going to give these gloves a 3-dimensional shape, I needed to measure all the way around my ring finger, my middle finger, one side of my pinky finger, and one side of my index finger. Once I had established those lengths, I was able to start sketching out a pattern that was basically going to be cut out as these strips that were going to be hand sewn into the sides of the fingers. So now that we have kind of a first draft pattern, let's try this out on some muslin to find out what works and what doesn't. I always find it's really important to press whatever fabric it is that you're using because any wrinkles could distort the pattern and affect the end result. To determine where the hole was going to go, where my thumb comes out, I lined up that antique glove right next to my new pattern and just made sure that the wedges of the fingers lined up, and that was a pretty good indicator of where the hole should go. Because this hole is such an unusual shape, it took me a while to make sure I had something that was correct and was going to line up with the thumb. But once I had done that, I traced it back over onto my original pattern just so that I could duplicate that again in the future. Because the thumb is so tricky to navigate, I am stitching it on entirely by hand. I made sure I was continually trying on the glove so I could make sure each area worked out before moving on to the next one. To ensure that I maintained as much control as possible, I found it best to hand stitch the tips of the fingers, but down the side of the finger, I used the sewing machine. Okay, so it's not terrible, but it's got a ways to go. So from here, I actually spent several days kind of working out all of the kinks and building out several prototypes until I finally ended up with one that I was super happy with. This can be a frustrating process, but at the end of the day, you do end up with a pattern that you're actually going to be able to use for the rest of your life. So in my opinion, it's very well worth the trouble. We are now ready to finally start sewing our actual gloves. Oh, let me break in here again really quick. Use a fabric with a little bit of stretch because obviously that's going to complicate your process just a little bit as far as finding a textile that's just the right color and pattern. But you're just going to want to do this because I actually tried using a faux suede that had no stretch. I even cut it on the bias to see if I could get it to do what I wanted. And in the end, I just ended up with something that's closer to an oven mitt. It's just not comfortable at all. So if you take anything away from this, please use a fabric that has some stretch. I think it was just about at this point that Professor Poof realized Werewolf was the star of this episode, and he got a little incensed. I'm using a fine point permanent black marker to draw out my pattern, and the reason for this is the lines that I'm drawing will not be visible and I don't have to worry about them disappearing like they would with disappearing ink. I'm using a darker, extremely stretchy fabric right here on those pieces in between the fingers, and I have a couple of reasons for that. The darker color will add to the contrast of the gloves and kind of make them look a little bit more interesting, and the stretchiness really lends itself well to the dexterity of your hands. Whenever I'm sewing something like this, it's really delicate and needs to be really precise on a sewing machine, I always dial back the stitch to be the slowest it possibly can be. That way I just maintain as much control as possible. When it's time to actually connect the thumb to the hand of the glove, it is so important to make sure that the correct sort of side lines up with its corresponding side on the glove. So I will be making a pattern of this, and I will be marking which one goes to which, just to simplify the process. Hand stitching anything this delicate is exhausting and obviously a little tedious, so I occasionally need to take a few cat petting breaks. I ultimately ended up doing about 2 or 3 passes over every single one of my stitches. Whenever you're doing something by hand, you want to make sure it's obviously as tight and clean as a sewing machine. So I find that multiple passes usually gets you pretty close. I did find that stitching the tip of the fingers by hand and the machine stitching down the length of the fingers was the best method to ensure that everything looked really clean and tidy. Once the index finger was looking perfect, I moved on to the pinky. The way these are already feeling compared to those vintage gloves that I always wear is a drastic difference. It's just amazing to be able to just easily slip your hand in. Your middle and ring finger are going to be a little bit trickier to put together because you want these tips that you can see sort of connecting right here to be perfectly level with one another. So it does take a little finagling to get it just right. Once I had all the fingers assembled, it was time to address the webbed area at the base of each finger. And it's pretty simple to do. You just pull out whatever excess material you have from that side piece, and you just stitch them together as tightly as you can and trim away any excess. After that was done, I went around to all of the areas that I had hand stitched and just did a finishing hem stitch just to ensure that nothing would ever fray and that it would look really organized. All right, so this is feeling really secure and stable and is amazingly comfortable. So now we're going to flip it right side out and start working on the exterior. We're now going to be adding some spines to the backs of our hands, and this accomplishes 2 things. The first is it just really helps the gloves fit a little better, and then in addition to that, it does mimic the tendons on the backs of your hand and just gives them a little bit more dimension and shape. What I'm about to sew here is essentially just an inverted dart, and you don't want to go too deep because you don't want too much excess fabric on the outside. So I would say don't go any deeper than maybe 1/16 of an inch. Okay, So now we're going to do an embellishment stitch right over the top of these spines. And something I tried for the very first time was waxing my thread. I've never done this before, and oh my gosh, I think I'm gonna do it every time now. It's so wonderful because just the tiniest little bit, one pass will do it. It just stops the thread from like tangling or misbehaving and just makes this process so much more fun. I'm beginning by gathering 2 different colors of thread, and this is just gonna make sure that I can get the exact shade that I want. Then I'm going to thread this through, and then I'm just going to slide it once over some beeswax. I'm now coming in from inside the glove, right at the base of one of these tendons. To ensure that the glove doesn't move around too much, I'm filling it with tissue. This way it's nice and filled out and is less likely to bend this way or that, and helps me get a cleaner stitch. What I'm doing now is something called a chain stitch, and you enter and you go maybe about 1/8 of an inch, then you wrap the thread around the needle, pull the needle completely through, and then it'll create like a circle. Then you use that circle as a point and you dive the needle right in the center of that, come back again at 1/8 of an inch, wrap the thread around, pull out, and what this does is it eventually creates the look of a chain. Once you reach the end, pierce the needle back into the glove, pull it out from the wrist, and tie it off. If you're unsure of how to do this, it's really great to just practice this using the exact thread and material that you'll ultimately be using. And now for my favorite part of this episode. I wear a lot of vintage gloves in winter, and one of the most frustrating things about that is I'll be sitting in my car or doing whatever, and I have to remove the glove to use my phone, which is, super frustrating, and you have to just keep putting them on, taking them off. And like I said, they're vintage gloves, they don't fit that well, so it's a kind of a process getting them on and off. Well, I think I have found a decorative workaround for that, and we're going to be tackling that right now. The way touchscreens work is through electricity, and so obviously fabric doesn't conduct electricity, so you need to get some conductive thread to connect your skin to that screen. Just like we did the chain stitch, you want to bring your stitch initially up through the inside of the glove, and once you're outside, put the gloves on your hand to keep them nice and taut. What I'm doing now is actually a very simple star stitch, and the way you do this is you start from the outside and you always bring the needle right in through the center once you've reached the end of one of these little legs. You do this 4 times until you end up with essentially a cross, and then you do this again 4 more little legs that are about half the length, right in the middle of those kind of pie slices on the sides. Once you're all done, pierce that needle in through that center, back into the inside of the glove, flip that finger inside out, and because you really want to make sure that there is contact between your skin and this thread at any given position, it's really helpful to make sure you have an excess amount of this thread on the inside. And the way I do this is I just double over that finishing hem stitch that we did before, and this just ensures that it's definitely going to be making contact. Now we're going to test with my middle finger, nothing, index finger, and it works. Because you do use your thumb so often on these touch screens, I'm also adding another one of these stars just to the tip and sort of side of my thumb. How neat is that? I like it so much. I think in my free time, I'm going to actually go and apply that to all of my vintage gloves because it will just make life so much easier. So now let's get back and finish our gloves. I wanted some buttons in a slightly darker shade of brown to sort of complement the fabric that I used. And so I'm creating these buttons by using one of these kits that you can get at Joann Fabric for covering buttons. It just honestly couldn't be simpler. They give you a template. You just cut out the circle that you need, lay the fabric down, and just follow the steps. And I don't know, it takes maybe like 30 seconds or something like that, and you end up with beautiful, professional looking buttons. There's a few different ways to tighten the wrist on one of these gloves, and I'm choosing to do a strap just because I want to make sure that there's never any skin exposed to the cold elements. And in addition to that, a strap is usually a little bit more easy to manage with a gloved finger as far as putting them on and taking them off. Now that my straps are assembled, I'm going to flip them inside out. And if you have a hard time getting a sharp point at the end of one of these, you can always just take tweezers or even the tip of a seam ripper just to kind of get it as clean as you like. From there, I'm going to lay some protective fabric over it and give it a good press. I'm now sewing on a buttonhole, and from here, I'll actually be ready to affix this to the glove. To ensure that I put this in the right place, I put the glove on and then pierced with a needle exactly where the strap needed to go across. And then I released the seam right there so that I could bring that strap through that little area. And then just to make sure that this whole wrist area gathers really beautifully, I am adding a little bit of elastic on the inside just so that it looks really even. The way that I'm doing this is to stitch both ends to either side of the wrist. And then from there, I'm actually going to put one of my hands in and stretch it out as far as it can go, and then just stitch really quickly and evenly across. It's now time to sew on the button, and then from there, I can affix the strap. The last thing we'll be doing is creating a cuff for the base of the wrist. Once I had a shape that I was really happy with, it was time to make the master pattern. The only part of this pattern that you'll see from the outside is the top half with those 2 points, and that lower half where I'm drawing the line right now is actually going to be tucked inside the glove, and you won't see it, but it will just kind of give like the edge a really seamless look. For the backing of the exposed portion of this cuff, I'm using a darker brown satin, which most of the time you won't see this portion at all, but just occasionally, like when you move your hand just right, somebody will get a glimpse of that darker brown. And it's just another little accent that hopefully will make this entire glove look really stylish and well thought out. Now that it's assembled and flipped inside out, I'm going to give it another really good press so it looks nice and crisp. We're going to sew that little seam down there at the bottom together, and then we'll be ready to apply this. If there's any areas that are a little too tight for the sewing machine to get to, I always like to hand stitch them just so that there's no way this thing can come apart at any point. We can now fold that extra fabric inside the glove, and then once it's looking really shapely and I'm liking how everything's sort of coming together, I'll give this a really good press. To make sure that extra material that we tucked inside the glove doesn't ever flip out, I'm going to do what's called a herringbone stitch along the seam of it, just so that it lays perfectly flat and it never wants to move about. And finally, our very last step is to sew on just a couple decorative buttons. The nice thing about these is, aside from just keeping your hands nice and warm, they're also incredibly effective at minimizing any evidence you might potentially be leaving at a crime scene. I am so pleased with how these came out. They're beautiful, but they're not so over the top that they're going to compete with any outfit that you pair them with, which is kind of the whole point. They're just kind of like an accent to whatever it is that you're wearing. And in addition to that, I now have a pattern for the rest of my life, which is just beyond neat. I will be making this pattern available to the second tier and up. If you need to make an adjustment, it shouldn't be terribly difficult. You can either just change the width or length on the fingers, and that should do the trick. So I hope you've enjoyed this episode. It's been terribly fun to make, and I'm really looking forward to sharing the future episodes that are on the way. So take care of yourselves, and I'll see you again very soon.